Welcome to this video series focused on learning Microsoft Azure. This series is designed to get you up and running with Microsoft Azure quickly. If you prefer written documentation, the article for this topic can be found on my blog, which will be linked in the video description. This is part 5, and we're going to be creating an Azure storage account. So to start, we need to go to the storage accounts pane within the Azure portal. If it's on your recent services, you can just press storage accounts. If not, just come up to the search bar and type storage, and then press storage accounts. In here, it will show you all of your storage accounts that you have available if you've already got some created. If not, you can just come up to the top and press create. This will take you to the create a storage account wizard, which will run through everything you need to do to create a storage account. The first thing you need to do is select which subscription you want your storage account to be in. I've only got one, so I'm just going to select my Azure pay-as-you-go. The second thing you need to select is the resource group, which houses your storage account. If you've got any existing resource groups, you can select one of them. If not, press create new and type a name for the resource group you want to create. I'm going to create resource group storage account demo and then press OK. And then this will create the storage account within this new resource group. The next thing we need to do is set a storage account name. This name has to be globally unique within Microsoft Azure. So for instance, if you just call this demo, it'll probably come back and say the storage account name demo is already taken. So because someone else has this storage account name, I can't use it. So I'm just going to call mine SA for storage account, UKS for UK South, and then demo. It doesn't look like anyone's got that because it isn't showing any red. So I'm happy with that. A thing to note that the storage account name can only contain lowercase letters and numbers. If you try and use a symbol, it will give an error to say it can only contain lowercase letters and numbers. For region, I'm going to select UK and select UK South, but select whatever either your closest region is or the closest region to whoever is going to be accessing the data within this storage account. Under performance, we've got two options. We've got standard and premium. For 99% of use cases, standard will be just fine. However, if you need lower latency for either block blobs, file shares, or page blobs, you can then select premium and then select a specific type of storage. But for this demo, we're just going to be using standard. If you press the information icon and then press learn more, it will take you to all of the types and what they can be used for. But we're not going to cover that in this demo. We're just going to create a standard storage account. For redundancy, we've got a couple of different options. We've got locally redundant storage, LRS, geo-redundant storage, GRS, zone redundant storage, ZRS, and geo-zone redundant storage, GZRS. These four options give different level of data durability. So if we go up to the images, so LRS, which is the least redundant option, still has 3 copies of your data split across a single availability zone within the primary region, so in my case UK South. You can then go for GRS, which is a geo-replication of LRS, so you have the 3 copies of your data in a single availability zone within your primary region, and then it also replicates that to a secondary region, or whatever the partner region is. So in my case, UK South's partner region is UK West, so it will replicate all of the data to the secondary region. You've also got ZRS, which stores all of your data in just one region. It still has the 3 copies, but each copy is split across a different availability zone. So in theory, this protects you from a data center outage within a region. And then you've got GZRS, which is the same as ZRS, but it also replicates that to a single availability zone in a secondary region. So if we go back to the wizard, these are the ones we can have. I'm going to select GeoZone redundant storage for this demo. And you'll notice there is a make read access to data available in the event of regional unavailability. So for the geo options, you can tick this, but for the zone redundant and locally redundant, you do not have this option. So what this means is, if for whatever reason your primary region goes down, you can still have read access to the secondary region and then read from the data. You can also just read from the data because it gives you a different URL. So even when it is not down, the URL that gets generated will be sauksdemo.azurestorageaccounts.azure.com or whatever it is. And then it will also give you sauksdemo-secondary.azurestorageaccounts.azure.com or whatever the link it generates you. And you can actually use this secondary link for read access to the data. But we're not quite going to cover that in this demo. So I'm going to select geo redundant. There is another thing to note is if you use premium performance, let's say we select file shares, you can only have locally redundant and zone redundant storage. So for the premium, you don't get any of these bottom options with the geo replication. You can literally only choose LRS or ZRS, which is the replication, which is the free copies of your data within a single region. So I'm going to select that back to standard and then geo zone redundant storage with read access to the replicated data. And then I'm going to press next. Here we can select some security. So you can require secure transfer. So this means that any access over HTTP is blocked and it has to be done over HTTPS unless you use a custom domain name. So if you bind your own domain name to the storage account, you can actually still, this has to be disabled, but we're not going to do that. So just bear that in mind. Enable public access on containers. So you can enable a container within a storage account to have public access to it. Just because you've got this enabled, it doesn't mean that the containers you create will be publicly accessible. When you create a container, you can then select what security you want on it, whether it's only locally accessible or publicly accessible. You can enable access keys. So if you don't want to be able to access the account using an access key and only use Azure Active Directory, you can disable that and then select default to Azure Active Directory authorization. You can specify what version of TLS you want to use or the minimum version. So by default, it is version 1.2, which I'd recommend leaving that unless you have some kind of legacy applications that can't use that and has to use either version 1 or 1.1. But I'd recommend if you do have to drop this down, create a standalone storage account for it. I'm not going to cover this one because this feature is still in preview. Azure Data Lake, that is a bit out of scope of this video, but you can enable Data Lake Storage Gen 2 and enable the hierarchical namespaces, which will give you access to some other options, but I'm not going to enable this in this video as it is out of scope. The last thing in the advanced is the access tier. So there are 3 access tiers. You can have hot storage, cool storage, and archive storage. Hot storage is the most expensive, cool is cheaper, and archive is cheaper than that. This just sets the default of what you want. So new files will be added to hot, and then you can create archive rules that drop it down to cool when it's not being used, and then put it into archive so many days after it has last been used. So I generally just leave this as hot for the default, and then you can create rules to drop it down to cool and then drop it into archive when it is no longer being used. I'm going to press next for networking. In here we can select how we want to access the storage account. We can enable public access from all networks, which includes the internet. Enable public access from selected virtual networks and IP addresses. So we can select our existing subnets. If you've got multiple subnets, you can select it here. Or you can disable public access and use private access and create a private endpoint and bind it to one of your networks. I'm going to, for this example, use enable public access from all networks, which will include the internet. Under network routing, you can either select Microsoft Network Routing or Internet Routing. If you leave Microsoft Network Routing enabled, it will use the Microsoft backbone to transfer the data around the world rather than the public internet, and just use the last part of the public internet to get to the customer. So for instance, this storage account is in the UK South. So if someone from the Americas access it, instead of it going across the internet from the UK to America, it will go over the Microsoft backbone and then come out of a Microsoft data center in the US and then go over the internet from there to the customer. So I'm going to leave Microsoft Network Routing enabled and then go on to data protection. You can enable point-in-time restore for containers, which will allow you to do an entire restore to a historical point. So say if you do daily backups, you can then restore the entire container to a previous date. So you can enable that. That will automatically enable versioning for blobs and enable the blob change feed. So if we enable that, it will automatically enable these and it will keep the logs forever. Or if you want, you can have the logs rotating, so after 7 days they will drop off. I'm going to select keep all logs. By default, soft delete for blobs, containers and file shares is enabled, and it keeps the data for 7 days. This can be increased or decreased to your liking. And then I'm going to go on to next and the encryption. By default, the encryption type is set to Microsoft Managed Keys. If you want more control over your encryption, you can select Customer Managed Keys, but I'm just going to use the Microsoft Managed Keys. For the Customer Managed Keys, you can also do it for blobs and files only, or all service types. You can also enable infrastructure encryption. So this will essentially double encrypt your storage account. So by default, it is automatically encrypted at the service level. So the storage account is encrypted, and then it will also encrypt at the infrastructure level. So it will be encrypted twice with different keys. So that will give you some extra security. We can then go on to next tags. I'm not going to set any of this, and then just go on to review. This will give us an overview of exactly what we have configured, and then press create. This will go through and then create the storage account. It should only take a minute or so. Now the deployment has been complete and our storage account has been created, we can click our resource group and then refresh, and then our storage account will appear. We can then select the storage account, and this will take it to our storage account administration page, where we can see the location, the primary and secondary, the performance, the replication type, and all of the information we have selected in that setup wizard. The majority of that we can change. Down the side, you've got all of the different panels which you can use to administer your storage account, but we're not going to cover any of this in this video. And in the next video, we'll go on to managing and using the storage account.